welcome to uh, winter in Minnesota. And I will have to say, of course, as part of this, I do have the fine city of War Road in the background. But of course, as a good Minnesotan, before I did that, I ensured that Roseau was not signed up for this webinar. So with that said, we'll do quick introductions.
So I'm new to the firm, so I'm probably a new face to most of you. My name is Christina Petsulis, and I'm a new associate attorney at Flaherty and Hood. I actually have a background in public health, so this is kind of a fun topic for me to present on. I was more in the area of preventative health, but infectious disease is something that I know a little bit about. So yeah, I'm looking forward to presenting today.
And my name is Brandon Fitzsimmons. I know a lot of you on this call and work with a lot of you. I'm shareholder attorney with Flaherty and Hood, and I head up the firm's labor, employment, and human resource practice area. So all I do primarily on a day-to-day basis is represent and advise local governments throughout the state of Minnesota. So with that said, once we get the screen moving, we'll jump right into the webinar topics. All right, so what are we going to go over today? So first, we'll go over a COVID-19 update. A lot of you are familiar with it, but we think that's a natural segue to what will be our second topic, which is the economic update. Third is COVID-19 employment trends. Now, that is still a topic we want to hit because, as you all know and are experiencing, we're not done not only with the COVID impacts on the economy, but we're not done with the COVID impacts on the law and how administrative agencies are enforcing it. And third, and practically, how our workforce is being transformed. Fourth topic we'll talk about quickly is where Minnesota's public sector is with compensation, especially taking into account the COVID-19 impacts. Then the fifth topic that we'll cover is a legal update, where we'll talk about what's happening with litigation trends that have been occurring and are continuing even with COVID, and especially with the safe and healthy workplace, which is still going to be a lingering issue even post-COVID, how agencies at the state and federal level are enforcing it. Vaccines, of course, is a hot topic. We're still getting a lot of questions on that. Can and should you require them? Should you even ask about them? Should you just encourage them? And then, of course, another issue intertwined with COVID, but also independent, is obviously at the federal level, we have a new president and a new Congress controlled, both the Senate and the House controlled by Democrats, which is going to have an impact not only in policy, but with what federal agencies are doing. So with that said, if you have any questions during the webinar, our approach is that if you want to hit the chat button, which may be in different places for you, but for example, it's for me on the bottom, you can hit a chat just to us as the panelists, and we'll do our best to field those questions, answer them through chat, and or if we think something's going to be applicable to the whole group, try to weave it in to our webinar as we go along. So again, bottom line, use the chat button for any questions or comments you have, and we'll do our best to address them. Now, let's jump right into the meaty topics. First, where's COVID at? Now, again, a lot of you hearing it on the news outlets, you're hearing it in your local media outlets, but where are we at? Within the United States, we've had over 26 million cases, nearly 440,000 deaths. Per the federal government, they do project that there may be over 83,000 more deaths in February directly attributed to COVID, which again means then we'll have over 500,000 deaths just attributed in the United States to COVID-19. Now, what is the positive is that the vaccines administered now exceed the total COVID cases, which has been a clear goal. So bottom line, per the CDC, as of yesterday, we had over 32 million vaccines have been administered throughout the country. Then we'll move on. There. Now, what's happening in Minnesota? Minnesota's had over 463,000 cases, over 6,000 deaths attributable to COVID-19. So again, it's easily projected that the state, by the time this thing is done, will clearly have over 500,000 positive COVID cases starting last year. Then when it comes to vaccines in Minnesota, is that we have about 450,000 individuals have had at least one of their vaccine dose, and of those, 116,000, or about a quarter, have completed their vaccine series, which again is the 2 doses with both vaccines out there. So bottom line, we're already at close to 500,000. Now, what's the issue and why the COVID not only impacts on society, but as you as employers, when it comes to laws and what you have to do practically and agency enforcement, is there are variants out there on the COVID-19 strain, which is causing some concerns whether or not the vaccine is going to effectively and efficiently prevent folks from getting infected and spreading the variant, even with the vaccine. So one is generally called the UK variant. And again, we're just highlighting these, though obviously we have a master's in public health on this seminar, just to demonstrate that, we're not going to be out of the weeds yet. So we have the United Kingdom variant, we have the South African variant, and the Brazil variant. So bottom line, there's 3 different variants that as per the CDC, though it's still science is evolving on it, they are now feeling a little more confident that the antibodies that folks get through the vaccine are being generated, will prevent hopefully infection, not only infection of individuals that get the vaccine, but prevent them from spreading it to others, even with the variant. But again, science is still evolving. These are newer variants. So let's see, which is why, again, a lot of us, as has been used, have COVID-19 fatigue, but we're not out of the woods yet. Obviously, this chart, without getting in the weeds of the numbers, demonstrates what has been and projected to be the substantial decline. Now, I will clarify there are 2 colored lines within this. One is currently what's projected, the bottom line, the maroon line, and then the other line is showing, there's still going to be a decline in COVID-19 infections, but the number of cases will still be higher if what's called the rapid variant spread. That is, if the variants we just talked about do spread and the vaccines aren't 100% effective with those. But bottom line, we're going to see a substantial decline with the variants, or even without the variants. It's just with the variants, we're still going to have more COVID-19 cases. Same similar line, they call it the bell curve within Minnesota. So by the time we get to May in Minnesota, the Minnesota Department of Health and other entities do project that we may, by May, be down to 1,000 cases a day compared to about 2,000 cases a day now. So getting there, but not yet. So again, what are the feds doing, which impacts all of you as employers? And we tried to highlight in outline form, obviously, who's the main entity at the federal level, and that's the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. That they've got 4 main goals they try to implement. Again, we have different administration, different approaches to prevent, detect, and respond to COVID, prevent, mitigate the transmission, gain a better scientific understanding, and implement and evaluate vaccine programs. So that's been the same goals they've had. Debate over how it's been implemented, but that's their goals. And again, we want to talk about the jargon we use, CDC, MDH, et cetera. A lot of you are familiar, but we think it's important to go through that. Then at the state level, as we'll go to the next slide, at the state government level, really, I think the governor's executive orders, which have been in place since March, so about 11 months, talk about what is the state's goal. And here's what we feel also is a good update. So one, they talk about they've taken mitigation measures to limit transmission in personal gatherings, but that the state still feels they need strengthening, including asking Minnesotans to limit travel, wear masks, physically distance, and avoid gatherings in private spaces, especially indoors, which again impacts all you as employers. And they talk about, though, many key metrics. Deaths from COVID, hospitalizations, case numbers, test positivity are now below where they were at for most of the severe stages. And then their third issue they brought up, however, is to protect the recent progress they've made per the governor's order. He still feels we need statewide coordination and resources to fight the pandemic. So therefore, in his last executive order, January 13th, he says he needs those tools for quick, equitable, and safe distribution of the vaccine. So that's the state. That's where COVID's at. That's generally how the state and feds are responding. Now let's get into a little more what's impacting you directly as employers. So first, the economic update. This is per the state, their most recent publication, their revenue and economic update of January. What does this show at the bottom? If you look at during the November forecast, right when we were at the COVID tank when it came to data, they are showing for this fiscal year that revenues are actually higher than projected. So I jumped accidentally to the this slide in just a moment. I'll go backwards. So bottom line, since I can't get back to that slide, revenues are up compared to where the state thought they would be in November. Then we get to, though, officially on the books, though this is going to change later this month when they put out another forecast. The state does say for the current biennium, the 2 fiscal years, there'll be a surplus of about 636 million. Now, likely with where the economy going and revenue is going, there's likely going to be a bigger surplus. Now, again, I'm going to put aside how that surplus is going to be spent, and taking into account the state's rainy day fund, et cetera. But they still on the books for the next fiscal year, which starts this July, which will impact for all those, most of you on this call get local government aid. Where the state, that's in the next fiscal years, 2022 to 23, that's where ELJ funding will come out of for 2021 and 2022. On the books, that's still about a $1.3 billion deficit. Now, again, with the improvement in the economy, with the improvement in the revenues we just talked about, that number is likely going to be less. Now, whether or not there's going to be a surplus seems implausible, but what we do know is likely that deficit is going to be a lot lower than the 1.3 billion when they come out with their next forecast later this month. Then we jump to what is the state predicting when it comes to the economy. So what are they saying? That the economic outlook is improving. They expect now that the annual growth in the economy this year for 2021 will grow by 3.1%. However, that was going back to November in their official forecast, but now they predict in 2021, the actual growth will be, instead of 3.1%, looking more at 4%. So what are they basing this data on? That their growth projection is based on the net effect of a few things. One, there was a surge in COVID, hospitalizations and deaths led to increased controls. But so in the short term, in 2020, they thought near-term GDP growth would be less. But overall, once the real impact of the $900 billion pandemic relief that was passed last year and their population estimates, looking at the labor force, households, et cetera, they do think the economy will grow again at a 4% clip in 2021. Then we get to the next slide. What does this show? If you look at the bottom there, it has the years that are at issue. So if you look at 2020, they do predict at the bottom that, no surprise, the economy would contract by 3.6%. But now in the blue, their most recent update shows they think the economy will go up by 4% in 21 to make up, for the decline, another 3.9% in 22, another 2.5% in 23. So as you know, all of you, that's going to impact not only your local economy, but what your local revenue stream looks like. So that's where the state's is at. Now let's talk about, next thing is we move from COVID to the economy to where are trends, especially in the public sector. So the Center for State and Local Government Excellence put out a survey going backwards to October, looking at the employment outlook, what concerns the employees have working in the public sector, and what's their general satisfaction and what specifically. So no surprise, I don't think anything earth-shattering in the study, but interesting nonetheless. 82% of employees said bottom line, COVID-19 pandemics impacted the nature of their job. And again, for a lot of you, that means working from home. 54% said it's negatively impacted their family. So these are people working and use the public sector. 46%, so nearly half, were very extremely satisfied with their employer. So again, you got about half of them thinking you're doing okay, though a little less. 17%, a small minority, doesn't feel you did what you needed to do, especially during the pandemic. Now, what are the elements of the job interesting in COVID-19 that people working in the public sector as employees, what were they most satisfied with? One, they like the fact that they're in the public sector, they had job security. Again, you look what happened with layoffs in the private sector, they've got a lot more security. So that was the biggest level of satisfaction public employees had. Close to it at the same level, they liked what their leave benefits were, especially a lot of you, no surprise, gave COVID-19 leaves from the state level down to the local level. That was in addition to paid leaves you had, and or you were more flexible with paid leave. So again, 62% of employees said with public employers are satisfied with leaves. Then the third part is you maintain their health insurance, you maintain contributions, and really, from my experience, you didn't really do much as a result of COVID-19 directly with health insurance. So again, that shows in the satisfaction rate of majority employees. What are they least satisfied with, however, currently working in the public sector? Salary, which always can be an issue in the public sector, 34% were satisfied, which means 2/3 didn't have a full satisfaction with where they're at salary wise. Potential career advancement, about 50%. Again, no surprise with millennials and Generation Z feel like there's not enough room to move up within the ranks within the public sector. And other non-traditional benefits, that's beyond your paid leave health insurance, such as fitness memberships, etc. Things you see in the private sector, not as much in the public sector. So about half aren't as satisfied with what you're doing with that. So again, I think that's a fair anecdote. Anecdotally, the pulse of where public employees are in Minnesota. Now, beyond those, updates on where employees are at. Now, what are going to be more the trends that really COVID-19 was a driver for in the private and public sector? One is all of you communicating effectively with employees about COVID. What are you doing about vaccines? What are you doing with folks with underlying medical condition? What are you doing with the anti-mask people? So again, what's a trend is messaging helps. To eliminate that fear, getting proactive, not just putting out reactive fires. And a lot of you doing that, as we'll talk about with your preparedness plans, you've had them placed with months, and as we'll talk about, you should continue to monitor and update. So that is really your go-to source. And I know a lot of you advising you legally, we're reliant on that. Say, hey, go back to a preparedness plan. When you're talking about communications, what to do in the workplace, how to mitigate fears of employees, go back to that. Second thing is training managers and supervisors managing remote work. Again, this is not applicable to your public works, to your public safety, but for your administrative, office, clerical staff, a lot of you are still doing that, staggering schedules. Some are coming back at a higher clip. But what is happening is, we'll talk about in Christina's part of the presentation, a lot more lawsuits related to that. A lot of people saying, I think my workplace is unsafe. I need to be working from home. So again, train your managers, rely on your preparedness plans, rely on supplementary notices or policies you put out during COVID on how to still effectively manage remote work. And then also, for some, it may sound mushy, but it's reality. Express sympathy to employees who worry not only about COVID, but about their privacy. If they got underlying medical conditions, they got to come to you. They got concerns about mask wearing, they got to come to you about it. They come to you about other generalized concerns, interacting with the public. Really, verify and solidify and have empathy and sympathy for privacy concerns. And that's something, again, we'll talk about when we talk about vaccines. This is a real thorny hot button political issue. We're getting a lot of questions on vaccines and concerns with employees about generally that topic. And then, of course, enforce COVID policies consistently. That gets back to have a good plan, train your managers how to implement your COVID policies. Now, beyond those satisfaction, beyond the trends, is Minnesota local government when it comes to general wage increases? Now, what is surprising to us when we started this in hindsight, but not surprising seeing where economic and financial data has come in. Really, what we've not seen is a big decline that when we put on our first webinars back in March and April, we thought we'd see in wage increases. So this data supports this, going left to right. What are wage increases for 2020? I know that's past tense, but some of you hadn't settled by the time March 1st came around. Some of you settled after March 1st, which we really feel is a bellwether for COVID timing. So really, we didn't see the needle move much for those who settled pre-March 1st or after March 1st of 2020 wage increases. In totality, Minnesota local governments are hovering, and the average general wage increased 2.8%. And I'll clarify, as we usually do, that excludes steps, that includes other performance or other pay that you give. This is just the across the board, also loosely known as COLA, that folks give across the state. Now let's jump to, all right, somewhat prospectively, though some of you haven't settled, some have. What we did see, though, for 2021, obviously because we had more settlements post-COVID on 2021, we have seen somewhat of a decline in the general wage increase Minnesota local governments gave pre-COVID, post-COVID for 2021. So going left to right, what does this data show? Those who settled on wage increases for 21 before COVID hit gave on average a 2.77%. Post-COVID settlements, or what you gave to non-union, was in the 2.42% range. So again, a decline by about 0.25% in the average wage increases we saw. Again, really, in our view, not as substantial as we thought it might have been. Anecdotally, what would I say? We didn't get really in the weeds. I think early in COVID, the March, April, May timeframe, we're seeing more 2% settlements. From May onwards, we're seeing more in the 2.5 settlement, and I think the data reflects it, why you have an average of about 2.42%. But the bottom line is, those who are still in the midst of negotiations, the settlement increases, as you can see, post-summer are going higher. But bottom line, post-COVID, we still see a decline in where settlements are at. And then in a later slide, we'll talk about what have interest arbitrators done, which again, for those who are unfamiliar, that's if you have an essential bargaining unit who can go to interest arbitration. Arbitrators can impose awards, but really we only have less than a handful of arbitration awards during the COVID economy that Christina will cover. Then we get to 2022. For those planning, a lot more of you have not settled, which is why we have less data. But again, similar to 21, those who locked in 2022 increases pre-COVID were at the 2.7% range. Those who've locked in 22 post-COVID are more in the 2.46% range. But bottom line for 22, we're still seeing total averages in the 2.62% range. So as you can tell, overall, thumbing through it, increases in 20 at 2.8%, increases in 21, 2.7%, 22, 2.6%. So we're seeing a decline, but I'll say this, I think when we present on wages come 2 or 3 more months, I think we're going to see settlements more in the average of the 2.7%, 2.8 range percent. Again, much like we saw in the pre-COVID world. So with that said, now I'll hand it over to Christina to provide the COVID-19 legal update.
Yep. So regarding litigation with COVID, unsurprisingly, it's really increased in the last few months, as it has taken time for employees to come forward and kind of consult with their attorneys and kind of put together their cases. So we're really seeing a lot of cases coming up in the past few months, and then also we're going to see it kind of probably ramp up. And this is really an area that's really uncharted, so to speak, legally speaking, just because there's not any precedent regarding what to do with these cases. And I think judges, really are going to be, making decisions based on different factors that we don't really know yet. So jumping into kind of what's been going on. So since March, so since basically the beginning of COVID, there have been about 1,600 lawsuits already. 142 of those have been class actions, which are many employees coming together with one common legal claim. And so those numbers are about state and federal courts, and 16 of those have been in Minnesota, and 6 federal cases, 10 state cases. And then kind of moving into the common complaints. So there's 4 main areas. There's 2 on this slide. So one of them is retaliation, and that would be employees making claims regarding being fired for coming forward about maybe some OSHA claims or other workplace safety claims that they have regarding COVID. And that also could be if employees are maybe violating workplace policy or state or local COVID related policies that they violate, and then the employer fires them. Similarly, we have wrongful termination, which would be, where the employer fires somebody for wanting to work from home, or again, for voicing concerns regarding COVID. Sorry, I'm just going to the next slide. And it's frozen for some reason. Another one is discrimination, and that may be regarding reasons why the employer fired the employee, specifically why that employee. Was it based on their age, or was it based on their pregnancy, which would have made them at risk for COVID? Okay, I'm sorry, just one second. Okay, here we go. So another one, again, another complaint would be workplace safety. So that would be failing to comply with workplace COVID policy. It's similar to the retaliation claims. So again, discrimination. So an employee could challenge, the reason why the employer fired them. They can say that it was for their age, pregnancy, and other factors that, health status that could be related to COVID. Maybe employer wants to get rid of an employee for not being able to come to work. So it's things like that. And then we have some information regarding potential upcoming litigation. We might see a lot of anti-mask stuff that hasn't really come up yet totally, but we could definitely see that in the horizon. Also anti-vaccination, if employers are requiring to have the vaccine in the workplace, that can also be a big issue. And obviously we're going to see that in the next few months as the vaccine gets rolled out and employers start to do their vaccine policies. And then post-vaccinations, when we start to go back to normal, we're going to see return to work accommodations. I think a lot of people maybe don't want to go back to the way things were pre-COVID. So there's going to be a lot of accommodations there, and kind of, things regarding FMLA leave, and things that were more normal pre-COVID that people are going to want post-COVID. And then regarding this kind of return to work accommodation, we actually do have a case here in Minnesota. It's a Minneapolis case, union versus the district court. It's a really high profile case, and we're going to be able to go through it a little later in this presentation. So I wanted to kind of go over the areas of enforcement. So we've got federal and state, and I wanted to start with federal, kind of the bigger picture. And so we start with, these 4 main agencies that, we've been hearing a lot about and how they're dealing with COVID. So just generally the U.S. Department of Labor. So that's the department that's going to enforce wage, hour, and benefit laws. We've got OSHA, who's going to handle more of the COVID-related safety complaints, and they're going to take illness reports as well. And then we got the EEOC, who's going to enforce those federal anti-discrimination laws. So we might see more of the EEOC involvement, as we see. So I was talking about on the previous slide regarding discrimination COVID claims. And then finally, we have CDC, of course, which doesn't necessarily enforce COVID guidelines or COVID rules, but they're going to establish the COVID guidelines, which then the other agencies are going to rely on to enforce. So just going into a little bit more of what U.S. Department of Labor has been doing regarding COVID. So they've administered the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, which expired in December 31, 2020 of this past year, but it may be renewed in the new proposed stimulus package by Biden, which we're also going to talk about later in this presentation. And then the U.S. Department of Labor also has authority over the OSHA Act, which is going to take, again, like I said, most of that COVID workplace safety control. And then we've got unemployment insurance at the federal level, as you can see from COVID this past couple months. Or not past couple of months, but past 6 months or so, the federal benefits being rolled through, and we might see more of that with the new administration. And then, of course, workers' compensation at the federal level, which is going to take care of claims when people get sick from COVID in the workplace and may even die subsequently. So moving into a little bit more of the OSHA regulations and how they actually kind of enforce COVID-related standards. So one of the regulations that's currently in place and how it applies to COVID is PPE standards. So already in place, of course, gloves, eye and face protection, but also a part of this PPE is rolled into COVID. So this is a standard that OSHA enforces, mask wearing, especially in places where it is mandated. And then a general duty clause, which is a kind of blanket provision that basically says the employer needs to furnish a workplace free of any hazards that are serious death or injury. And so COVID does fit into that category. So it is the employer's responsibility to make sure that the workplace is free of COVID risk. And then moving in a little bit more of the regulations from OSHA. So there is a reporting requirement, which does apply to COVID, that would require the employers to report hospitalization, specifically of when an employee gets sick from COVID in the workplace. The one important key here is that the hospitalization needs to occur within 24 hours of the exposure to COVID, which it might be unlikely based on incubation periods for the COVID infection, but it's definitely something to keep in mind. And then for deaths, if the employee dies within 30 days of that exposure, that would also be a reportable fatality that the employer would need to take up with OSHA. So a little bit more on OSHA violations. So maybe unsurprisingly, in 2020, there was a large influx of OSHA claims, and I'll talk about maybe reasons why that's the case. So OSHA inspections have resulted in a lot of different kinds of violations. So one of them is, like I was saying on the previous slide, failing to report an injury or an illness, which COVID is covered within that category. And then also recording that injury with OSHA. They have very stringent recording keeping rules, which the employer needs to take note of. And then also, of course, the general duty clause. So these are just some examples of what OSHA has been enforcing in the last year. And then this is kind of a little chart that shows the workers that were removed from a COVID hazard for those reasons I cited on the last slide, whether that be unsafety regarding mask wearing or not having sanitation protocols in place, things like that. So as you can see, the numbers have kind of steadily increased, and we're not entirely sure where OSHA is going to go in terms of their enforcement, but we'll talk about a little bit about that in the next slide. Okay, so this is kind of a slide describing the the reasons why maybe OSHA has increased their enforcement. As Brandon was talking about earlier in the presentation, communication is a big key in this era of COVID, and many OSHA claims are due to a lack of communication and a misunderstanding from the employees of really what protocols the employer is taking into account to keep the employees safe. And subsequently, the union has really taken a lot of action just because employees, are wanting that support. And so they're trying to reach out to somebody that they know will advocate for them. So when they don't feel that support and communication from their employer, this is the place that they go. So again, it's critical to kind of give that messaging to employees about what the employer is doing regarding safety concerns, so they can eliminate fears and not make these OSHA claims that maybe could have been prevented. And then, of course, review, update, and enforce the Minnesota Required Preparedness Plan, which ties into all of this so that the employee really knows what the employer is doing to keep them safe. Okay, and then so moving into kind of the next level of enforcement, this is state enforcement of COVID regulations. So the first kind of layer is executive orders. So as you know, back in March, this is kind of the first main executive order that came out. It's the declaration of emergency. Minnesota had called it peacetime emergency. And so this really laid the foundation for the public to know that there are going to be more enforcement and action taken regarding COVID. And so that was back in March. And then in that same order, Governor Walz had taken note that any worker who can work from home must do so. So that's kind of when the work from home enforcement started. And it also took note that all work must be conducted in a manner that's up to OSHA standards, MDH, and CDC guidelines. So this really laid the foundation for where we're going to look in terms of agency enforcement for the rules and guidelines. And the governor's order is really kind of the foundation for pushing those regulations forward. And then we have the mask mandate. This was a little bit later on. And it requires everybody to wear a mask, as you probably know. And it requires a face covering in indoor businesses and indoor public areas, but then there are exempted individuals, and those individuals are people who have medical conditions, medical health conditions, or disability that doesn't allow them to wear the face covering, or individuals who it would create a risk of their health if they were to wear one. Some circumstances where you don't have to wear the mask when speaking, performing, testifying in indoor spaces or public areas. And then when an individual is alone, maybe when in an office or a room or a cubicle. So that's something to keep in mind with the preparedness plan, just laying those guidelines out clearly, that when people are in their office, they can take off their mask, but if they're going to get up and go to the bathroom, they're going to need to wear their mask. And then moving on to the preparedness plan, as I was just mentioning. So the preparedness plan was part of this executive order 2074, and that was rolled out in June, the end of June. And so the preparedness plan obviously requires cities to implement a preparedness plan in addressing specific areas, and those areas include, requiring work from home whenever possible, ensuring sick workers to stay at home, social distancing, worker hygiene, cleaning, disinfection, and ventilation protocols. And all of these are kind of tied into what CDC has been recommending. The executive order kind of relies on the CDC guidelines in order to put through these requirements. And then moving into other state agencies that are enforcing COVID. So there's Minnesota OSHA, which is an arm of OSHA. It's Minnesota's own department that enforces the OSHA standards at the federal level, but then they also have additional COVID regulations at the state level that they can that they can enforce, and part of those are from the executive orders. And then we have the Minnesota Department of Labor and Industry, so we call that DOLE, and that enforces, COVID-related workers' compensation claims, which we'll talk about in a little bit here. And then we got MDHR, Minnesota Department of Human Rights, and they're going to enforce kind of that more accommodation space and more of the discrimination space, which we'll also talk about. And then MDH, which is going to establish the guidelines, not necessarily enforce the guidelines, but really establish those guidelines that the executive order relies on and these other agencies also rely on. And then CDC at the federal level, which kind of has an interplay with MDH, they really kind of rely on each other. Well, MDH relies on CDC to kind of really get their COVID guidance from. Okay, so moving into Minnesota OSHA a little bit more specifically. So they have the authority to enforce Minnesota OSHA standards, MDH, and CDC guidelines as applied to workers, including social distancing and hygiene. They may also issue citations, including civil penalties and closure of some spots. So that's really Minnesota OSHA's main force relevant to us here in Minnesota. And so we have some data from Minnesota OSHA compliance in this past year up until November 2020 from the start of COVID. So they conducted 828 inspections and 175 of those were COVID related. So, that's a pretty good number that are COVID related. Of the citations that were issued, 1,200 of those, 131 of those were a COVID component. And, those were likely, like I said before, regarding mask wearing or not reporting or other things that are contained in the executive orders that Minnesota OSHA has authority to enforce. And then, of course, the general duty citations, like I said, those could just be kind of it's more of a blanket provision. So it's covering a lot of the different other areas, just generally unsafe for somebody to work in. And then we've got a little bit more information on kind of their outreach. So Minnesota OSHA received about 16,000 email and phone inquiries in 2020, and that's a 250% increase from 2019. So as you can see, there's really a lot of action from employees and maybe their unions really wanting to enforce COVID regulations that they feel employers are not adhering to. So then we're going to move into the more Minnesota workers' compensation area. As many of you may know, in April 2020, the Minnesota legislature passed a new bill regarding workers' compensation. And this bill provided a rebuttable presumption that certain employees who contract COVID have an occupational disease that can be covered by workers' compensation. So that means that if an employee gets sick in the workplace, that's a worker compensation claim. And so maybe unsurprisingly, that had a huge effect on the number of workers' compensation claims in the last couple months. Through December 2020, the department received approximately 15,000 COVID-19 workers' compensation claims, which is just really, really big. So it actually was 36% of all of the claims that were filed, which is a really large number. So as you can see, this is a chart summarizing that data. So this has a couple different numbers. So the red line, which is the line on the bottom, that's the line that shows the COVID related claims. And as you can see, that legislation was put into place in April. So as you can see, it steadily increased the number of COVID claims since then, and it has really spiked. And it looks like it's continuing to increase. Okay, now moving into more on the Department of Labor and Industry. So they are the ones that issue citations and create civil penalties regarding unhealthy or unsafe working conditions. They're really tied with OSHA, and they're going to penalize businesses that retaliate against employees as well. So this is moving into MDHR, Minnesota Department of Human Rights. So the work from home helpline is something that maybe some of you cities have experienced. So the work from home helpline is kind of also uncharted water. We don't know a ton about it and their authority. So what they've been doing is they've been reaching out to cities and kind of bombarding them with questions regarding employee complaints that were made to them via the helpline. And they've been kind of making threatening and harassing statements about potential actions that they can take. But Brandon has had a few interactions with the helpline and has kind of stated there appears to be a lack of authority. They didn't really state what their role is regarding COVID, or if they're, how they can enforce certain work from home accommodations. So at this time, there's no verification that the helpline has any authority to support these alleged violations. But if you do have questions, of course, talk to Brennan and I, and we can help you out if you do get emails from this helpline. Okay, and then so moving into this Minneapolis work from home case. So this is a very recent case. This kind of really rolled out last week. So a little bit background about it. So the school district, Minneapolis School District, made a decision to reopen schools in person starting February 1st. And so some of the teachers were really unhappy about this. It seemed like it was a very expedited decision to make, and it kind of took teachers off guard. So they went to the union, and the union made a demand to bargain over the reopening of the schools as part of the contract. And the district basically responded and said, well, we don't want to formally bargain, but we will have, ongoing collaboration and problem solving for teachers to have a safe environment when they go to school. But essentially, no matter if you have a work from home accommodation, you have to come in. So the union complains that, it's concerned that the district is refusing to engage in formal bargaining, and that this is going to be a problem. So they filed an unfair labor practice charge with PERB, and basically the charge stated that the district was making a unilateral change to the CBA without bargaining, and specifically regarding the accommodations that were previously granted, which were required by the executive order, as we previously stated, that executive order that allowed teachers to have accommodations to work from home. And the district further stated, the union further stated that the district is refusing to negotiate, and this is kind of, the meat of the claim that the district is really refusing to negotiate the terms of the agreement, and the union is not happy about that. Additionally, the union also filed a request for a court order with Hennepin County District Court that would block the district from reassigning teachers to work in person. And the response from Hennepin County was that they accepted that request for an order. And so the next day, actually, so that request was made on January 29th, and this came out on January 30th. They accepted the teachers' work from home accommodations request, and the order specifically states basically the district is enjoined, meaning they cannot require members to return to work starting February 1st. And secondly, the parties are going to meet again on February 9th, so that's next week, to talk more about what was happening on the January 29th hearing. And so this is some of the court's reasoning that we got to access. So the court concluded that the Dahlberg factors do support a limited temporary restraining order. The Dahlberg factors are the standards for a court to give a temporary restraining order. But the more important part is that the court reasoned that the teachers have already proven that they can teach remotely. And since about 40% of Minneapolis teachers have opted to continue distance learning, that the accommodations should stay in place. And this is kind of what I was talking about at the beginning of this litigation section, is that we don't really know what courts are going to rely on. And so as you can see, the court really relied on past practice being the fact that 40% of Minneapolis students, have opted to do distance learning anyway. So as you can see, again, we're not really sure what courts are going to continue to rely on in terms of making certain determinations. And then moving into the more kind of arbitration award space. So I wanted to give two examples of cases where the arbitrator mentioned COVID. So a little bit of background about this case. An employee with COVID symptoms, they're quarantined for 7 days at the employer's direction, but he was forced to use sick leave instead of the pandemic benefit. So the issue was whether the employer violated the pandemic pay MOU contained in the labor contract. And the conclusion was that the employer did violate the pandemic MOU, and that basically pandemic leave does not end until the employee is permitted to return to work, kind of going off of the language of the contract. And that, the contract was clear that that's the leave that the employee gets to take. Another example is from Millennium Hotel. The employer eliminated a lead engineering position due to lack of work and discharged the employee, while other engineering positions still remained. So the issue here was whether the employer violated the seniority resignation article of the CBA, and the arbitrator said that they did violate that part of the CBA, and that the employer specifically felt that the financial strain of the COVID-19 pandemic, the arbitrator said that was justified. It was justified that the employer, was financially strained, and this was a decision to make based on the circumstances of COVID-19. That is its right. However, where the arbitrator said the employer kind of screwed up was that they should have laid off and then replaced the less senior employee they should have put him in a less senior position rather than just getting rid of him completely, since there were other less senior positions available. And then kind of moving just into a summary of arbitration awards in general. So there were 2 interest contract arbitration awards addressing wage in BMS, and those were the ones that were posted. So there might be other ones, but these ones, the arbitrator really recognized the economic and financial uncertainty of COVID. And another type of claim, pandemic changing the way workers work. The arbitration award was a little bit more lenient on the employee and their expectations. The arbitrator kind of opined that harsh discipline for failing to meet certain expectations by the employee, they may not be warranted, given the different working conditions that employees are experiencing. They may not be expected to work the same way that they did pre-COVID. And then another interesting part arbitrators had mentioned was that the pandemic creates financial uncertainty for governmental units, which means, employers are really justified in taking certain employment actions based on their financial burden. So that's kind of the good news for cities. So moving into the hot topic of vaccinations. So the biggest question that we've been getting, of course, is, can employers require employees to take the COVID vaccine? So the EEOC came out with some pretty big guidance that kind of addressed this question, but they didn't really give a hard and fast rule. They more kind of discussed the different areas of of liability for employers. And basically, they said employers may require employees to be vaccinated, but they didn't necessarily recommend that employers do this. So it doesn't say that they can't or shouldn't require the vaccine. It also says that it kind of goes into the different areas of laws that it might interact with, which includes the ADA. Basically, administering the COVID vaccine is not a medical exam under the ADA, so that's good news. But the pre-screening questions that you would ask prior to the vaccine administration that would elicit some information, it would be a medical inquiry under the ADA. Similarly, if you're eliciting information about genetic information, which could be even questions about your family's susceptibility to disease and things like that, that would also implicate Genetic Information Discrimination Act. And then EEOC also did mention that unvaccinated individuals that will expose others to the virus in a work site is a direct threat under the ADA. So that's kind of a good thing for employers if they do want to require the vaccine. But there is one caveat at this time. I think a lot of the general public think that the COVID vaccine is 100% approved by FDA, and that's not true. It's actually approved for emergency administration. So at this time, we're recommending that employers don't require the vaccine because it's not 100% approved by the FDA. So some issues that may come up when employers are able to mandate the vaccine when the vaccine is 100% approved by FDA. So the employer may need to pay for it if they're going to require it, which will, of course, increase the financial burden of the establishment. Employers may be liable for injuries that would result under workers' compensation. So if they get sick, a lot of what's happening with the vaccine is people are taking it, and with a lot of other vaccines, you get sick a little bit afterwards, maybe for a few days, you kind of feel symptoms of, nausea or headache, things like that. So that's also something to consider. And then employers may need to get the union agreement for unionized employees, so that you would need to do an additional contract with the union. But at this time, we should note that we're not necessarily promoting the requirement of vaccines, and instead it might be better, since it's kind of an uncharted territory, that cities consider encouraging and promoting the vaccine and not necessarily requiring it, because you might be surprised by the people that will voluntarily take it on their own. Some vaccination mandate exceptions, if an employer does mandate the vaccine, obviously under ADA, if there's a disability that the employee has, that would be exempt from that requirement. Additionally, Title VII, religious accommodation. So if the employee has a sincerely held religious belief, they can be exempt from that requirement. Of course, if no reasonable accommodation is available. And then GINA, as I was talking about before, that was genetic information. And that is, employers must be cautious regarding the pre-screening questions that would elicit genetic information questions. And like I said, that could be regarding immune systems of family members, which would be a no-no. And then another question that has been coming up a lot is whether employers can question employees about vaccine status. Have you taken the vaccine? Do you plan to take the vaccine? Things like that. And so some considerations to take into mind before doing that is kind of considering, what is the purpose of you asking? What are you going to do with that information? Another big consideration is obviously data. If you are going to ask, you're going to need to give a Tennyson warning. And these type of questions would classify as private data classification. So you would need consent to, divulge names in the event of a data request. So requests from the public, you may be required under the Minnesota Government Data Practices Act to disclose, summary data of vaccinated employees. So that would include, the number of employees that you have vaccinated, not the names. But that still might create kind of a public relations problem with cities, especially if they've had low numbers of vaccinations. So that might be kind of a thorny area. Another issue is discrimination concerns regarding First Amendment, asking about it and expecting an answer. And then, of course, liability. Data is showing that low vaccine rates may support claims of unsafe workplace. So things like that. And then I'll hand it over to Brandon to finish it off.
All right. So we've obviously covered a lot of light topics with COVID, but now we'll shift gears as we talked about new president and new leadership, not in the U.S. House, but at the Senate level. So what is that going to mean for all of you as employers? I'll wait for the slide to move. So first thing is, as we move to the slide, to no surprise, obviously it changes whether it's a Democrat or Republican, generally the Democratic presidents and the individuals they appoint, the policies they push, the regulations are enforced, tend to be more pro-labor, pro-employee. So we'll put some substance on that when we talk about what we think the Biden administration will do and the new Congress. And there we go. So, what are some of the agenda items that are impacting all of you as employers right away? Obviously, President Biden said he wanted to tackle COVID-19 in two areas. One is get mass distributions of vaccines. Christina talked about the thorny legal issues with employers in that. Secondly, we'll talk about an economic stimulus package where more money is being proposed to go to local units of government. Second big item is increasing the minimum wage. Now, what he already did through executive order and mirrors what he's doing, trying to push what has to be policy, is he has unilaterally raised the minimum wage for all federal employees to $15. And that's what we're seeing in legislation. Third, on the labor relations front, though, obviously the federal government, though there's a nuance with new law, does not govern directly. All of us govern as Minnesota public employers by the Public Employment Labor Relations Act. However, a lot of what happens at the federal level, especially with the National Labor Relations Board and decisions they make that directly only impact the private sector, those types of laws and policies tend to end up in arbitration awards, tend to end up in BMS decisions, tend to end up in legislation that the Minnesota legislature may push. So again, it's not going to directly impact what he does with labor relations, but we think it indirectly will have an impact. In addition, another thing they're scouring through the U.S. Department of Labor is what's called independent contractor status. Do you have contractors, third parties doing work for you as local governments? They're going to much more scrutinize under the Biden administration through the U.S. Department of Labor, or are those really employees that you should be providing minimum wage and overtime payment for, and not treating them as an independent contractor and just paying them under the contract? So we think there'll be a lot more scrutiny with that. So no surprise, generally pro-worker, pro-employee, or pro-union individuals appointed to U.S. Department of Labor, to the National Labor Relations Board, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. I mean, that's more obvious politics when you switch from a Republican, Democrat, or vice versa. Now, what's in the proposed stimulus package? Obviously, a lot of uncertainty. Where exactly is this going? But bottom line, it's a $1.9 trillion package proposed by the Biden administration. $1,400 stimulus check to most Americans, additional 400 weeks in unemployment through September 2021 on top of their baseline state benefits they get now. And as I indicated, 15-hour minimum wage, because that is likely would be, of all things here, just on principle, black and white, the deal killer. though it's in what Biden proposed, it's unlikely going to be in the final legislation. So instead, it's going to probably surface somewhere else, a $15 minimum wage. Which I obviously could have a big impact for all of you. Now, of course, there'll be carve outs for your municipal facilities for seasonal, part-time, younger employees, but still, bottom line, most of your employees may have to be bumped to 15. Who knows where that'll go? Another thing is economics. Proposed 350 billion that would go to state and local governments. But just to be clear, why that's really a hot potato. The Senate Republicans, who are now in effect in the minority, have said they want no aid to go to state and local government. So who knows where that'll go. And then $160 million to promote and push a national vaccination program. Then one of the biggest questions we get, we'll talk about now, is going backwards to March, there was the Family First Coronavirus Response Act. And that was the act that included the two things going backwards: 80 hours of sick leave for the most part, if an employee was absent due to COVID, which is on top of any other leave you provided. Then two was expanded Family and Medical Leave Act for individuals who couldn't show up to work either because of their own issue or if they had school or childcare issues. So full circle, that expired December 31st, 2020. So bottom line, there is no federal law that says you have to provide federal paid sick leave or expanded family and medical leave. Now, on a quick side note, some of you, though I wouldn't say it's a majority, but maybe it's close to 50-50, are still providing some form of what you're calling COVID-19 leave or pandemic leave. Or some of you, we've had other employers we work with, are actually taking what was the former law and saying, we're going to apply that voluntarily going forward. So, for example, how's it working for a lot of our employers? They're going to say, all right, you had 80 hours of sick leave. Regardless of what you used, if you used some or you didn't, we're going to allow you to use up to 80 hours for the same reasons, voluntarily out of our own pocket, less any of that 80 hours you use going backwards. So some of you are voluntarily doing that. Now to segue, which is a question we got as well, there is legislation that may get through potentially as part of the stimulus bill that would basically renew what we all were used to. And that is you get up to 80 hours of federal sick leave, and you get either an additional or as part of your 12 weeks of FMLA leave, you can take time off to care for a child or family member, either for COVID or if a school or daycare center is closed as a result of COVID, and get 2/3 pay. Now, how is it different within what the Biden administration is proposing? One, he may increase that FMLA leave from 12 to 14 weeks. And then, as we talked about, that to increase benefits, that the maximum you'd have to pay is up to $1,400 a week. Now, again, I want to clarify, it's still going to all be based on an employee's wages, but it's increasing the maximum, which was in the prior law. And then three is those state and local governments, which would be a new thing. He is proposing that all of you, if you have under 500, would be reimbursed for either having to pay the emergency sick leave or paying what you'd have to under the expanded family medical leave. So bottom line, it's still being negotiated. Now, a question we had was, can this go retroactive? So if they adopted the new law, will this apply going backwards to leaves taken January 1st or later? Now, as a general proposition, most laws don't and can't go retroactive to leave time. Now, whether or not they try it, we haven't gotten into the weeds of that. I think it's unlikely it'd go retroactive, but yeah, I suppose it's still a possibility, but I know it's recorded, but I still think it's going to be unlikely to go retro. That's so difficult to do legally, but yeah, it's open. So we're not going to get in the weeds of how to administer it, but bottom line, here's what we think. It's going to be administered with the same reasons, same forms, same policies you all had as you did before, but it's just going to be an increase in the level of benefits and apply to 2021. So it's just going to be more economics, more leave for you, instead of likely many of the conditions that would warrant a leave or forms you use being different. So you probably just have to dust off what you did. But bottom line, that's still being negotiated. We don't know whether or not it'll pass, but we wouldn't be surprised. Now, the next piece of legislation that causes some legal confusion, but we don't think It's likely going to directly impact Minnesota based on our Pell law. But bottom line, it's sending the message from the Biden administration that they want to guarantee under federal law that every public service employee, put aside what exactly that's going to mean, but it likely is going to mean just about all government employees, would have a right to, and I'll distill this slide, to collectively bargain. Again, all of you are used to that under PELRA. We have that law. It's probably more intended for those states who either have weak or don't have a PELRA-like law in the first place. So yes, it could be a big deal. Yes, legal will have to scour it. But bottom line, we think if this even passes, which it could with full Democratic control, we just don't know if it's going to directly impact. Now, again, if they say PELRA is lower than the minimum standards, well, yeah, then PELRA will have to be updated. But we don't know if that's going to happen because our law, our collective bargaining law, is from the employee and union perspective a lot advantageous to them. So again, bottom line, we don't think it's going to be a Minnesota issue, but for other states. Then, as Christina talked about, we already know OSHA is going to ramp up, not just for COVID, but general enforcement. And how are they going to do that? We all know it's practical. You have laws, you have regulations and enforcement powers, but the issue, can these agencies practically do it? Bottom line, OSHA is clear, Biden administration is clear. They're going to get a lot more inspectors out there, which is going to happen likely soon to address COVID-19. So you look at Christina's data, I think we're going to see more of an uptick. So again, that's why you want to say, a lot of you may have COVID fatigue, but as employers, we can't give up because yes, cases may be going down, but if you look at it with the new administration, enforcement powers are going up. New regulations are going to be enacted. So bottom line, as employers, we can't have the fatigue because of the enforcement powers will be ramped up. So again, I want to still full circle, though not in a slide. Here's our view. Because the preparedness plan was required under governor executive order, all you've had it continually to monitor, update, enforce, and train your managers on that. In our view, from Team Legal's perspective, for those who we dealt with, again, it's not just when we have to deal with the U.S. Department of Labor, OSHA, it's on a practical level. If we have an employee concern, as you know, we always say, all right, let's go back to our preparedness plan, use that as a guide, and tell the employee, the employer still wants to continue to work from home, even though some of you are returning back to work at a higher level. Look here's our preparedness plan. Gets back to the Minneapolis school district case, which we don't know. What did the Minneapolis school district preparedness plan look like? Were they able to address it? So bottom line, if that document's continually monitored and updated, we think that's going to be one of your best legal defenses, not only for complying with the executive order, but for defending OSHA claims, even on the practical level, any concerns from employees or unions. Now, what they're going to also do beyond beef up more inspectors is they're going to allow OSHA under law to do a lot more what we'll call unilateral rulemaking, to write emergency rules, for example, to address the pandemic. It is in the stimulus package that we just talked about, where OSHA would be able to draft a lot more substantive and extensive regulations on their own without waving in half for Congress to act on much of it in the case of an emergency, which we think they'd exercise right away with COVID. So bottom line, we think there'll be more stringent rules to address COVID in the workplace if and when that stimulus package passes. So we've addressed some of the issues. And again, here's a theme we're going to continue to hear in executive orders and the enforcement through Department of Labor and Industry, and enforcement from the work from home helpline, enforcement from the district court level. There's going to be a lot more work from home complaints and a lot more work from home complaints and concerns to state agencies, and a lot more work from home litigation. So we think of all the COVID-19 things that'll linger until it's eviscerated, which could take months or years. I think that's where really we're going to see the core issues. And we're dealing with that too, as Christina brought up. We've had a sour pills experience with work from home helpline. So we think those things may actually ramp up again. It's for the employees, we think, that are going to have, much like the Minneapolis school teachers, are going to have more of a generalized concern. Are you doing enough? I don't feel safe. And we're going to have a lot more practical and legal debates over that with employees. Because again, a lot of you have ramped up your facilities. You've got personal protective equipment in place. You should be enforcing mask covering. But of course, we've all been in those union negotiations, even virtually, where you got 6 union reps huddled in a room, maskless. Those are the types of things you got to enforce. That's right. Still, again, to clarify what Christina talked about too, those executive orders are still in force in effect. The bottom line says you got to wear a face covering. Oh, but by the way, here are some exempted individuals. Here are some exceptions to it. But bottom line, you can't be more liberal in when you don't allow face coverings. Bottom line, you can only be more stringent. So again, that executive order is in place. So if you're enforcing the executive order, enforcing your plans, back to this slide, we think you're going to be in good shape for any employee union or OSHA concerns. Now, OSHA right away, 9 days into the Biden administration, issued some extensive guidance. Again, bottom line, I don't want to sound too broken record, but if you got a good preparedness plan, you probably already in compliance with the guidance before it was issued. But here's what you need to do. We need to make sure we're doing those hazard assessments that were required, identify control measures. So again, go back to your plan. Now is a good time under new administration with OSHA ramping up enforcement, even at the state level, to make sure not only do you have it, but are you enforcing it? Are you updating it? And are your employees and supervisors at the front end complying with it? So now is your good time to do that full-fledged audit and make sure you have the equipment. Now, beyond OSHA and the COVID and safe and health issues, we also have U.S. Department of Labor. Again, no surprise, we think we'll go a lot more back to more of the Obama administration perspective in utilizing U.S. Department of Labor to do what? One is we think some of you experience it. You probably put up the grimace emoji. We're going to a little bit more, and I think we'll see more of a creep on FLSA overtime issues, especially with public safety. So now is your good time to do your internal audit. How are we making sure we're complying with FLSA overtime? Maybe you're complying with your labor contract for overtime pay, but on top of that, that's never enough. You also always have to continually ensure you're calculating appropriately. Not only were FLSA, Fair Labor Standard Act overtime hours worked, but are you appropriately paying for those? And our view is this: it could be painful at the front end, but it's a lot more painful at the back end if we're not doing it right. So we are going with some of our local governments are doing that FLSA audit right now. Again, yes, it's painful, but we feel if you do it now, you can avoid the litigation. And practically where we're seeing that a lot more from the millennial or Generation Zs who are a lot more website savvy. They're Googling this stuff. They're collaborating on social media with their cohorts in public safety and saying, oh, I didn't know about that overtime issue. I didn't know if I need to, like we put in the slide, check an email from home. I should actually be logging that time as time worked. So again, back to the work from home issue and not only overtime in this, I think we're going to see a lot more uptick of complaints and litigation over, especially your law enforcement officers you give the 15-minute call to, or they're drafting an email at home on some incident they worked on. I think you're going to see a lot more aggressiveness from the employees and the unions to say, pay up. We're recording those hours worked. They count towards FLSA overtime. Pay either the minimum wage if I haven't worked OT, and or pay me overtime pay, and or trying to, which is still the weakest argument, pay me callback under my contract. So again, watch these work from home issues. Watch public safety asking their officers once they're at home to answer a phone call, write an email, and let's make sure we're appropriately calculating over FLSA overtime pay, not just what you're paying under the contract. So bottom line, we're going to see a lot more aggressive enforcement of DOL laws. And then we get to, we're also going to see this, we think, at the state level, not just federal level. So we've talked OSHA, we've talked Department of Labor. Now let's talk discrimination issue. So again, no surprise, new Democratic administration. There's going to be much more of an employee-friendly focus when it comes to enforcing anti-discrimination laws. Now, one is, we already know in the third bullet, they're going to revise their guidance on religious discrimination and how all of you as employers should accommodate that. In addition to that, again, no surprise, we're going to see a ramp up in not only guidance and policies and regulations from EOC, but also a lot more ramp up and practical enforcement from EOC. And again, as Christina hinted at, where is the uptick in discrimination from our going to be? It's really going to be around these Americans with Duty Disability Act cases where employees with medical issues, especially with COVID related concerns, are going to ask for accommodations, and EOC is going to be scrutinizing that much more and enforcing that. Then I want to do one step back related to that is the U.S. Department of Labor is also going to ramp up and be a lot more aggressive if the new what was called the Families First Corona Relief Act leave is reinstituted again. That's the federal sick leave, 80 hours, and the expanded family medical leave, either 12 or 14 weeks as proposed by the Biden administration. They're going to much more scrutinize to make sure all of you as employers complied with that. I know we had some dings as we saw the news releases with, a couple cities per U.S. Department of Labor in Minnesota got dinged with not complying with that. So again, now is a good time with the lull when there's not a federal law in place, and especially for those who are practically doing it on your own, to make sure you've got the right forms, make sure you've got the right notice, and let's update those. Again, we're working with a lot of local governments right now on updating our what we loosely call the FFCRA leaves, emergency sick leave, and expanded family medical leave, to make sure our policies are good, make sure our forms are up to date, make sure we're administering it appropriately. Because again, through U.S. Department of Labor, I think enforcement will be ramped up if and when, which seems pretty plausible, that's going to be enacted. So again, we've talked OSHA, we talked U.S. Department of Labor, and now EOC. And as we're winding down here, I'll try to get to the next slide. There we're at the conclusion. And what I've tried to do is weave in answers now to some of the questions we did receive by chat. One involved, reporting for OSHA work comp purposes. If an employee has COVID, are you as an employer bound to report that or record that for OSHA purposes? Are you required to fill out a first report of injury for workers' comp purposes? It's not that simple. If an employee in a vacuum says I have COVID, that's not enough. But what you have to do is do some due diligence to determine, maybe not a formal investigation, but do some due diligence to determine, all right, unfortunately, could that have been work related? Did they happen to get it from somebody else in the workplace? A member of the public? Do we maybe not implement our preparedness plan where they were working? So do some due diligence to look into it. That's your obligation. It's not automatic recording, not automatic fill out a first report of injury. Even though there's a rebuttable presumption employees got it at the workplace, again, do some due diligence. That's your obligation. We talked about retroactivity, another question on the new paid leaves. Then another question came in on whether or not the fact that the governor has the executive orders that have been in place for 11 months, a lot of you on the local level have had mayors and or councils declare emergency. Can we just say, all right, despite what the contract says, we're going to do something different than what our labor contract says when it comes to pay, when it comes to scheduling employees? The answer to this is no. The only person who has power to do that is the governor at the state level when it comes to state labor contracts. His declaration allows him, again, there's nuances to it, but bottom line, he doesn't always have to fully comply with state employees on labor contracts. Unfortunately, there is either no direct law nor case law unless you have good language, which a lot of you have some of it. I know working through us in the League of Minnesota City template, but it doesn't give you the carte blanche authority, even despite a state emergency, federal emergency, local, to violate the labor contract. So no, that's not the case. Now, that may give you good grounds, even back to the layoff cases, for example, Christina was talking about, to justify taking actions. But bottom line, you can't directly do something contrary directly to your own labor contracts. So another logistical question, and is now we'll jump to that. So first of all, what are some good resources for those who are in Greater Minnesota? Obviously, the Coalition Greater Minnesota Cities, available to all of you, those, the website. But, we do a lot of this targeted communications to cities who are members. In addition, we do have our COVID-19 site, set up available to all of you, which I will clarify does include a recording of this webinar and does include a copy of these slides. So that'll be posted soon after the webinar. So definitely feel free to use that, especially for your HR staffs. Then another issue is, for all of you who got the invite for this webinar, that's obviously how you got on it. As you know, we're always continually trying to compile compensation data, health insurance data across the state. So we encourage you to fill out that, albeit a lot of questions, a lot of check boxes and fill in the blanks. We encourage you to fill out that compensation survey. So as soon as you get a settlement, you can use that same link that we had on the invite, and we'll be on the next slide if I can get to it. Then we get to the last thing we want to bring up, though I can't get to the slide, is we already have scheduled 3 future webinars. And the next webinar will be in March, and that'll cover what is a real hot topic for a lot of you as cities and counties, and that is dealing with public safety fitness for duty, not only employment issues, but benefit issues. So how do you work with them to accommodate under the ADA? How do you work with them on workers' comp? How is it going? What's the impact of what I do on them getting duty disability benefits? What do we do knowing that if they get duty disability, we'll have to continue their health insurance and pay for it till they're 65? So that's just an issue that we have had a high volume of, and it's a real statewide issue. So that's going to be our next seminar topic. Then the one after that will be in April, and that'll address wage and hour issues. And we wanted to wait a little bit until the Biden administration, U.S. Department of Labor, has done their thing, and there it is, in ramping up enforcement. So come April, we're going to have a substantive webinar on overtime issues, minimum wage issues, and exempt status. What do we mean by exempt? Some of you are treating people as salaried and not having to pay minimum wage and overtime, but I think there's going to be a lot more scrutiny of that. The fourth item too is looking at independent contractors. Are they really independent contractors for you, or are they really your employee that you're on the hook for? So that's something, once we hear more from U.S. Department of Labor, we thought April would be good timing, a few months into the new administration. And then also, we all know COVID will have some impact on benefits, wages, hours worked by employees. So that'll be a good time for us to give an update on that as well. Then the fourth topic is probably going to mirror a little bit, but we'll make it a little more Q&A, question and answer, interactive. Come May 25th, when we'll know a lot more where COVID is, we'll know a lot more where the Biden administration is. We'll hopefully have had a budget wrapped up, so a lot of you know where your finances is. So we thought May 25th would be a good timing to do an update on all those loaded issues. So full circle, again, we appreciate all you participating in the webinar. We encourage you, 1, to fill out the survey we linked on the slide and in the invite, and 2, we definitely encourage you to attend our next webinar. And of course, 3, as always, this is team labor employment. These are the issues we do every day. This is what we have the passion for, and we're committed to serving local government. So feel free to call us for any customized questions and answer you have. So again, we appreciate all your time, and feel free to watch a recording and get the slides on the CGMC COVID-19 website. So thanks to all of you. Thank you.